talking about something what did we discuss last time we were in here? What did we discuss? Brother William, what did we discuss last time we were in here? Do you remember? Okay. Carolyn, what did we discuss last time we were in here? Thanks. What's that? Languages, yes. We're discussing languages, biblical languages, which we've got 3, right? First one is Hebrew, then Hebrew segued into Aramaic. Remember what was Aramaic? It was a Semite language, but it was a conglomeration of Hebrew and Chaldean, right? It was a slang. It was basically what we would call slang, kind of like you hear people call about Spanglish. You know, people it's kind of a conglomeration of English and Spanish, and the people who speak it and speak it well, man, they segue back and forth with no issues whatsoever. Aramaic was like Hebrew in that it was written from right to left. It was read from right to left. Same spellings and same everything, but there were some things thrown in there from the Chaldeans, and it was a language of the exile. But after people brought back, they didn't come back with Hebrew. Because remember, there was a generation of people born outside of Israel. So they came back speaking Aramaic, and it was commonly accepted that Aramaic was the language that Christ spoke. That was the language of Jesus Christ, the Aramaic. Hebrew had fallen. Hebrew was used in the temple, but other than that, Hebrew was really not spoken widely. There were so many other people that were there, and then of course Aramaic was used by the Jews. But what was everybody else using? Greek, language of the world, and it was the Greek language that took the message of the gospel to all the world. That was. It's interesting. It was first spoken in Aramaic by the people that were there, but you know, so on the day of Pentecost, who heard the gospel being preached? Every man in his own language. So it was that language was no longer a thing. You know, once again showing the demise of Judaism. It was to be done away with. No longer a thing. All right, that's what we talked about last time. Now we're going to get into a little bit of kind of. You know, when we read the Bible, the whole point of hermeneutics is so that we can better interpret what it says. And when we interpret it better, we can best discuss it better. We can best preach it better. Good thing for us to know. So today we're going to learn a little bit about the idea of figures of speech. We said when we first started this that the Bible contains a lot of things that we would be very comfortable with. And we're going to talk about that a little bit this afternoon. The Bible contains tragedy, it contains humor, it contains not comedy, but the idea of humor. God has a sense of humor, which is good. Okay? How else do you explain the platypus? Explain the platypus if God doesn't have a sense of humor. Or the giraffe. Explain that otherwise. It makes no sense that it would be an animal like that, but I think God has a sense of humor. He says, hey, you know, I'm going to make a thing with a long neck. It's just humorous to me. It's pleasing to me. All right? So there's all kinds of different things. There's romance, the idea of the Song of Solomon. This is a man who's devised this. It's a poem. It's a beautiful love story to his beloved. So there's all kinds of things that we find in the Bible. We also find what we know as figures of speech. Figures of speech. Why are figures of speech? Why are they important even in the English? Tell me why figures of speech are important. Yes. Huh? Yeah, I'm putting you on the spot. Why are they important? Why are figures of speech important in literature and English? Okay. It helps us sometimes it enables us to understand maybe a complicated concept by making it into a figure of speech. And we're going to talk about those a little bit. The reason I asked Tina is because she likes the literature. I'll let you know. I'll give you a list of questions next time in advance. Figures of speech are good because, you know, when we read, good literature has it peppered all throughout it. I mean, no matter what great form literature takes, there are going to be figures of speech in poetry, in prose, in both fiction and nonfiction. Anything that's written, they're going to have a figure of speech because those, for one thing, they liven up the subject matter, right? Right? When we do, for example, when there's someone is preaching a sermon, isn't it nice when they do sort of an illustration? Illustrations have figures of speech in them. And what it does is it livens up a subject that may or may not be very entertaining other than that. Parable could certainly be a form of a figure of speech. And we're going to talk about the various types here in just a second. So you'll see some of these, and I'll give you plenty of verses. Everybody, get out your Bibles. I'm going to ask people to turn. So everybody going to help me out, please. Okay. But figures of speech are used by writers, and these are divinely inspired writers. These men are writing with the inspiration of God through the Holy Spirit to put down the things that they found. So we know that these figures of speech came from God. God knew that there are ways to convey things, and sometimes that way includes using something other than just straightforward, verbatim. Okay, use a figure of speech. So a figure of speech is best described as a word or phrase used to communicate something other than its natural meaning. Used to communicate something other than the natural meaning. For example, in English, you might hear the phrase, well, that doesn't hold water. Okay, that's a figure of speech. That doesn't make any sense if you don't use it as a figure of speech, because you're not referring to, for example, water. And, what holds water? A bucket, some sort of a vessel. Well, when you say somebody's argument doesn't hold water, it means what? There's no weight to it. There's nothing to back it up. That's what we mean by that. And most of the time, you hear people use those phrases, and we know based on where we are and how we grew up, the English language that we speak, most people will know those. There are some that are very particular to a place, okay, a region, right? There are phrases that we use in the South that if you go anywhere else, they go, what are you talking about? That makes no sense. Okay? I'm plumb tickled. Go to Arizona and say, I'm plumb tickled. They're going, what are you talking about? I'm tickled to death. I'm tickled pink. Okay? I found this out when I was at Freed Hardeman. We had people that were there that were students from foreign country. And many times their English was definitely not their first language. Sometimes they spoke it kind of haltingly, but we would engage in conversation, and you would say something that we would understand. It would be a Southern colloquialism or a phrase or turn of phrase or figure of speech, and of course we would know what they're talking about. They would look at us, what are you talking about? I remember one where a guy, and I'm trying to remember, most of our foreign language students were from either Central South America or they're from Africa. There's this African fellow, and he went to one of the local drugstores to pick up some stuff, some toiletries and things like that, so that he could have in his dorm room. And a friend of mine was with him, and he told me about this laughter. He was laughing about it, and after the fellow was explained to him, he understood it, and he kind of chuckled. But while he was there, he checked out. And the lady, as he's walking towards the door, the cashier just very pleasantly said, now y'all come back, you hear? And we understand that. Well, he hears that, and he turns around and walks back to her, and she says, did you forget something, honey? He said, no, you told me to come back. She said, no. What I meant, I'm pulling your leg. And he said, you didn't touch me. But you see, that's, a figure of speech. And now, for me, I would know, she'd say, now y'all come back, and I'd say, okay, see you later. He turned around and went back to her, thought maybe she had not given him enough money back, or he forgot one of his items. That's that concept, that idea. But that's very, very, that's very much a Southern thing. Now, y'all come back now. He very much took it literally. Now, if everything in the Bible was written literally, it would not lose its import. It wouldn't lose its message, but it would lose some of what makes it such an incredibly robust document. Such a robust thing for us to read. There's some turns of phrase, especially in the Psalms and in the Proverbs, where you read it and it means something because of those phrases and those figures of speech. So we're going to talk about a few of those and show you where some of these are and show you but never thought about it like that before. Okay, one of those is, of course, simile. Okay, the simile. The simile, of course, uses the words like or as. All right, so let's look at a couple of those. All right, Psalm 90, verse 4, and then Proverbs 1, verse 27. So Psalms 90, verse 4, and Proverbs 1, verse 27. Psalms 90, verse 4. Whoever has that, just go ahead. Okay. Who has another translation of that? Psalms 90, verse 4. Okay. Okay. All right. The same phrase, but you can see where one it says is like. Okay. But what are they comparing it to? What are the two things being compared? 1,000 years and what? And yesterday. So what is it doing? It's comparing two things, right? It's what is it talking about over? What's the overarching theme here? God's definition of time. God's idea for him. We think, oh Lord, it's been 2,000 years since Christ came, and how long is it going to be before you finally send your son back? And we're thinking, oh, it's getting about time, and he's thinking, you don't know what my time is. 1,000 years to me is nothing. I'm eternal God. So 1,000 years to me, it could be 2,000, it could be 1,000,000 years, and for me, time doesn't flow the same way. It's hard for us to understand that, but God tries to make it as apparent to us as possible. He's comparing. For me, it's like yesterday. It's like, I just got up. It's 1,000 years past. So he's making a comparison. He's making more of a direct comparison. The idea, it's a stated comparison. Okay, this is like this. There are people, even people who don't know English are confused about that kind of thing. Proverbs 1:27. Proverbs 1:27. Okay, so like here, what's being compared? What's the overarching thing? What is he talking about? Or what's going on in our lives? Okay, distress in our lives. And he's comparing it, because you know what? People talk about it. It was like, someone receives bad news. It was like a kick in the gut. It was like a punch in the gut. It's just talking about how the comparison. When you receive bad news, you hear all these people, hear about these people that their loved ones are in an accident or something, they lose their loved ones, and that knock comes at the door. I watched a couple of movies, especially the old World War II movies, where the woman's standing there and she's cleaning up the kitchen. All of a sudden, knock on the door. She looks out and there's those army trucks parked out front, and there's men that are standing there. And she knows what they're there for, and it's like a kick in the teeth. Yeah, that's basically what he's saying. It's comparison, but it's using the words like or as. This is like this, or this is as a such and such. Okay. So we've got that. Now go to Matthew chapter 23. Matthew 23 gets into a little bit, bring us a little bit more focused. Matthew chapter 23, verses 27 and 37. Matthew 23, 27 and 37. $37. Okay, so here he's talking about two different things. Of course, are occurring in verse 27 and 37. But he says these hypocrites, these scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites. Okay, you are like. Now, are they like that? When you looked at them, would you see a whitewashed tomb? No, he's saying you are like this because, like the tombs on the outward, you look beautiful. Have you ever been to? I've been to cemeteries where you walk in, you think, wow, man, this is really pretty. But really, what's happening? What's right underneath the surface? You've got decomposing bodies. I'm sorry, there's no way to make that sound or look any prettier than that. You've got these lushly manicured lawns, and you've got the beautiful headstones and all that kind of stuff, but really underneath, what's going on? Their body's decomposing and all the stuff that goes along with that, absolutely. And he's making that comparison to these men. You dress nicely, you enlarge the borders of your garments, you wear the phylacteries around your head and on your, as a frontlet on your hand, and you make these big appearances in the marketplace and everybody, but really on the inside, you're just as dead and decayed as the tombs that you won't go near. I won't go to a tomb because it's unclean. But you're just as bad. Okay? So, and then in verse 37, he talks about himself, right? He says, how I've longed to gather you to me as a what? Hen does with her chicks. We've got hens. I would like to see this kind of behavior because I have seen it where all the chicks come and the hen just kind of fluffs her wings out and those chicks go right up underneath there. Now the hen will do its best to protect them, but the whole point is it gives a sense of comfort to the chicks. All right, and that's what Jesus, he says, this is what I want to do. This is what I want to do with you, but you won't let me. Okay. All right, so we've got our similes, and then of course we've got our metaphor. The simile is more of a stated. You are like this. You are like this. You are as this. The metaphor is not stated. The comparison is, of course, intended, but it's not stated as a comparison. Okay? So we'll look at a couple of those. Somebody want to turn to Psalm 3, verse 33. Psalm 3, 33. Unstated comparison between two like things. Okay? Psalm 3, verse 33. I think I wrote it down wrong. All right, Matthew chapter 5, verse 13. What did I put down? I wrote down 333, but that's obviously not it. Matthew 5, verse 33. See if I can find what I was looking for in Psalms. Oh, Psalm 3, verse 3, not 33. I'll read it real quick. Psalm 3:33. Psalm 3:3. But thou, O Lord, art a shield for me, my glory, and a lifter up of my head. Okay? You are this. Now, you're like this. You are this. Okay? What's Matthew chapter 5, verse 13? Okay? So what's the comparison? Salt and what? We are, right? We're the salt of the earth. You know, that's carried through even to today. Remember, you hear people talk about how good somebody was. Man, they're just salt of the earth. You know, good folks, salt of the earth. Well, we find that that came through from the Bible. The idea of being salt of the earth. What is good? What's the great thing about salt? Why would we be compared to salt of the earth? It's good, right? Hey, listen, there are some foods. Truthfully, if you don't put salt to them, ooh, you know, I like grits, but you know what I like on my grits? A little bit of salt, a little bit of pepper. For some folks, you know, it's like just screw the cap and just pour it right in there. But there's some things that we don't like unless it's got some salt to it. Okay, good country ham is salty. That's what makes it good. Virginia ham, I like it. A little red-eye gravy, salty. That's why you don't eat a whole lot of it. But yeah, that's what makes it good. So that concept of, so what does that tell? What does that make us? We're good. What do we? Okay, we do. Salt for the longest time has been, it's a form of currency. The idea of salary, the word salary comes from salt. When someone's paid part of their pay, so part of their salary was a portion of salt. That's where the word salary comes from. Ooh, okay. So yeah, it's a metaphor. You are this. The interesting thing is it's not a stated comparison. It's actually telling you that you are this, you are this, you are this. All right, one last one. Colossians 1, verse 18. Colossians 1, verse 18. Colossians 1:18. Okay. He is the what? The head. Now, we think, okay, well, no, that's not really, that doesn't fly, because the head, when we talk about someone being the head of something, the word actually comes from the part of our body that's on top of our shoulders. The idea of being the head of a corporation or the head of a family or the head of the church, that stems from the bodily part, not vice versa. Okay? So when we think of the idea of someone is the head, like I'm the head of our family, well, that comes from being a top. As God is the head of us, we are the head. The man is the head of the church, or the head of the household. Christ is the head of the church. That falls from the idea of being actually this part of our body that's over top. So, does that mean that Jesus is a big disembodied floating head? No, of course not. And understanding figures of speech help us to explain that. Now, if somebody reads things literally, guess what? This could be very, very confusing. Well, the Bible is contradicting itself. It says that he is this. Well, no, that's a figure of speech. And see, I've gotten into so many discussions, and sometimes it's devolved into an argument about the idea that the Bible is full of contradiction. Well, why? Because it says that Jesus is this, but it also says that he's this. No, you're being obtuse. You're not putting into the conversation that there are going to be figures of speech. The Bible is full of figures of speech, and we'll do it a couple more. But you have to accept that. Any form of literature is going to have these kind of things in there, and you have to be able to look at them and read them and understand we can't take everything literally. Sometimes it's meant figuratively. And the figures of speech are very much figuratively figures of speech. All right? Oh, I mean, he is the cornerstone. He is the gate. He is the, all of these things. Well, it says that he's this. How can he be both things? I said, well, I'm a father and I'm a husband. I'm two things. Why can I not be both things simultaneously? He is both Son and God. Why can he not be both things at once? Well, he can be. Okay? But once again, you're talking about people who intentionally want to misinterpret the Bible. They intentionally want to misunderstand, because if they can do that, then they can cast aspersions on anything that we might say. All right? Now what we get into is the idea of an idiom. What's an idiom? What's an idiom? It essentially boils down to this. It's an overstatement. Statement, overstatement, or exaggeration. Okay, it's an exaggeration. All right, there's a couple of these. The one that we probably know most often is this, and this is another one that I have a hard time explaining to people in Scripture. It's contained there, and its intended purpose in being placed in Scriptures. And that's the idea of hyperbole. Hyperbole. What's hyperbole? It's a great exaggeration. You're putting it all out there. It's hyperbole to say that all of these people are like this, or you've seen a lot of that over the last election cycle, right? Everybody that's this is this way. Everybody that's this is this way. Everybody's this is this way. Well, I mean, you got people that's their job. Their job is to kind of create that kind of a mind thinking, a process. So they engage in hyperbole big time. I mean, they want to make sure that we know that everybody who feels this way is this, and everybody who feels this way is this. Like everything else, you probably find the truth somewhere in the middle. Okay? So here's an example of hyperbole. Let's look at that. Matthew chapter 19, verse 24. Matthew 19, verse 24. Now, the whole point of hyperbole, it's an exaggeration, but there's a reason for it. It's to make a point. To make a point. But Matthew chapter 19 and verse 24. Okay. All right. Now, this is probably one of the biggest examples of hyperbole in the Bible. There's a great exaggeration, and it's for a purpose. Now, I want to put something to rest. For a long time, it was commonly thought that in Jerusalem, in the gates of Jerusalem, there was a gate. It was called the Needle's Eye, and it was so small that only one person could go through at a time. And if you came into the city after curfew or lights out, that you had to go through. There is no such gate in Jerusalem. Never has been a gate like that in Jerusalem. In all the times that it has been destroyed and rebuilt, there is not a gate or an opening in the city called the Needle's Eye. This is an exaggeration. It is to prove a point. What was Jesus saying here? He says it is easier for a camel to go through, we're talking about a literal camel, through a literal eye of the needle. It was easier for a camel to go through the eye of the needle than it was for a rich man to enter heaven. So he's making a gross exaggeration, but he's making that exaggeration as a point. He's making a point, and what's that point? It is almost in the essence that it's impossible for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. And he's making an exaggeration. It is that people who are wealthy, in many cases, they're consumed by their wealth, and they're consumed with the pursuit of wealth to the point that they leave off everything else. That they abandon all other pretense to obeying God. That's his point. He's not talking about a gate where it was, it could happen, but it was very difficult to do. He said, it's a gross exaggeration, and it is to prove a point. Because it is. Because people who are very wealthy oftentimes say, I don't need anything else. I don't need anything else. I've got my wealth. I'm an island. I live by myself. I live by my own rules, and I have what I need, and I don't need anything from anybody else. I got this for me. I worked hard for it. Their conversation is peppered with I and me, I and me, I and me. That was one of the great problems. Matthew 5 verse 29 is another example of the idea of hyperbole. Matthew 5 verse 29. Okay, is Jesus engaging in hyperbole here? Yeah. Does Jesus really want us to engage in self-mutilation? Is that really his desire for us to do? No. What is he saying here, though? He is making a very salient point. He said it would be better if you went into life without an eye or without a hand or whatever, if that was what was going to keep you from sinning. He said, but that's not the case, is it? Is the eye independent and does its own thing, and you have no control over that eye and what it looks at? No. That's the point he's trying to make. If our eye was independent and it did what it wanted to do, and there's nothing, my eye just keeps wanting to look at nasty stuff and I can't control it, yeah, it probably would be better if we plucked it out. That's not really the case. Same with our hand. We know what our hand's doing. We're adults and we're human beings. We know exactly what this hand's doing. I know what this hand's doing at any given time. The point is he's exaggerating. He said it would be better if you just lopped it off and threw it into the fire rather than sin. If that's what's causing you to sin, it'd be better if you did that. He's just engaging in what we would call hyperbole. Just a gross exaggeration, but it's to prove a point. And was he right? I mean, of course he was. Absolutely. And he was right about the idea of the rich man entering into heaven. How many times, I dare say almost anybody here could raise their hand. They know of somebody who is a member of the Lord's church that began to become prosperous and successful and began to really do well in the ways of this world, and unfortunately they lost sight of where they were, and they began to be more inclined towards the world. And I don't need to be, I'm worried that if I maintain my integrity, if I maintain my standards, that I'm going to lose business, or I'm not going to be received by the right people, or whatever it might be. And there are plenty of members of the Lord's church who've got successful, and they are nominally members of the Lord's church anymore. They're unfaithful. Just to be honest, they're unfaithful because they would not maintain their integrity. Okay? All right, next one, here's our idiom. We've got hyperbole, and then we have what's called an idiom of understatement. This is another thing, all right? And there's a couple things that we got underneath here. One is irony. Probably one of the most misunderstood and incorrectly identified parts of speech that there is. Everybody wants to call something irony that's not really irony. Okay? Irony is this: it's stating one thing while meaning the opposite. That's really what it boils down to. There's some nuances to it, but that's basically what it is. You're stating one thing, but you mean something that's different. Oftentimes, it's expressed in sarcasm. I'm not a big fan of sarcasm. I think it can be misinterpreted, and a lot of times it's not taken very well, even though it may not be meant as in a harmful way. But a lot of times people take it, and there are people who use sarcasm extensively, and unfortunately, they're not really the most fun people to be around because you never know what are they. Yeah, what are they? Do they mean what they just said? I mean, are they being rude or are they just being sarcastic? Anyway, let's go to 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel chapter 6 and verse 20. 2 Samuel 6, verse 20. Okay. Was she coming out to give him praise and glory? No. She was being very pointed in her criticism. Because look how she described him. How say it again? How what? Okay. How glorious was the King of Israel today. So she starts out as, oh wow, okay. So she starts out all very well and good. How glorious was the King of Israel today, who uncovered himself today in the eyes of the handmaids of his servants, as one of the vain fellows shamelessly uncovers himself. Well, that's, she's making it out as if this is praise, but the words are not praise. She's very much criticizing him for what he's done. She basically calls himself one of those what fellows? Base fellows. Someone who is not elevated in thought, not elevated in deed, someone who is very coarse and crude, and someone who is not to be praised whatsoever. Okay, so that's that concept of you're saying one thing, but you're really meaning something the exact opposite. She's not praising him at all. She's criticizing him very pointedly. Matthew chapter 22. Matthew 22. You can see here. If you look at these figures of speech, it adds so much to the scriptures. It really does. It makes the scriptures really come alive when you see some of these things that are done, and you see where God is very cognizant of the way that we talk. He knows what we will understand. I'll give you an example. Go ahead. No, they're not. Yes. Yes. Even the people that were unknown, those unknown writers, were still they were very intelligent. The average citizen of Israel was what we would consider to be very, very able to read and write. Okay? They were knowledgeable. They weren't all well instructed in that regard, but they were intelligent people, and they knew something when they read it. If they weren't, there would have been no point in him putting these in here. It would have been no reason. He would have just said what he had to say and been done with it. But that's not what happened. He puts these things in here so that the scripture really tells us something. It really comes alive. Matthew 22, verses 15 and 16. Okay, so yes. All right, so the Pharisees are doing what? Are they seeking to make friends with Jesus? No. They send out their disciples. Notice they didn't do it themselves. They sent out those who would listen to them, those who were hearing their words, those who were following them. They're disciples. Disciples of Christ and disciples of the Pharisees. The Pharisees had disciples as well. So what do? Did they show up and start accusing him and haranguing him? What do they say? They come with flattering words, don't they? Now that's not what they mean, but they meant something opposite of what they were saying. It says, "We know that thou art true." Okay? Flattering him with their words. Thou art true. And they teach the way of God in truth. Neither carest thou for any man, or thou regardest not the person of men. So they're being very flattering, very flowery in their speech, kind of what we call buttering him up. Now, of course, it wasn't fooling Jesus at all. Jesus knew what was in their heart. He wasn't caught off guard at all, and he was able to answer them exactly the way he needed to answer them. But this concept, this idea of an idiom of understatement, they're understating the matter, and then they're going to make him think that, of course, they're coming to him as a friend. We just really want to know. And what was the question that they asked him after this? Yeah, is it lawful to give money to Caesar? Is it lawful to give? And really, what their point was: is it lawful to give the money that we would give to God? Is it lawful for us to give it to Caesar? And of course, Jesus shuts them up. He gives them a brilliant answer, which speaks to us even today. Because what was his answer to them? What does he ask first? He says, he commends. Okay, and then what? Show me the tax money. So they bring the tax money, a denarii, and what does he say? Whose likeness is this? And they say what? Whose was it? Caesar's. Well, God's picture wasn't on there. So he says what? Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and render unto God that which is God's. The whole point behind this was he takes this very, very loaded question. He makes a very serious point with it, because what he says is this. He says, the question that he asks is, whose image is imprinted on it? That was key to his thought. Whose image is imprinted on it? And when they said, well, it's Caesar's. If his image is imprinted on it, then it's his. It's his. So give it to him. Whose image is on us? God. What do we render to God? Ourselves. That was the point behind that he takes this loaded question and he makes a brilliant philosophical point. He says, what's on that image is Caesar's. And if that's the image that's imprinted on it, then that's who it belongs to. God doesn't care anything about that money. Money means zero to him. That concept we talked about just a couple minutes ago, 1,000 years is to God. What's $1 million to God? Nothing. It means nothing. It was printed here. It was mined here. It was smelted here. It was coined here. When this world is over, what's going to happen to that? It's going to evaporate into the elements from which it came, and then it's going to be completely done. So does God care anything about the money of this world? Not a bit. Whatever we give to God, whatever form it takes, is just to show Him that we have purposed in our hearts that we are going to return back a portion of that which we've been blessed. But really, at the end of the day, what? Money means nothing. What's imprinted on us? God. God's image is on us. So that's what we render to God. Money means nothing. Anyway, all right. 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 8. 1 Corinthians 4 and verse 8. I hope I didn't write that one down as read down. Didn't sound. That's what. Yeah, that's not the one. That's not the one I had in mind. That's not. That's one that I wanted to use, but that's not the right one for. Not the right one for my point. So let's move on. I don't know why that one's. It's kind of written separately, and I think I might have written that down just as a thought process for something else. So just ignore that one. Okay. All right. So we do understand the idea of irony, though. Irony is saying something while meaning something that's opposite. There's unintentional irony, right? Unintentional irony. You've seen somebody that I'm trying to remember the fellow's name. He was big in the counterculture movement back in the '60s, and he ended up dying in a traffic accident because he was so counterculture. He would not walk at walkways, so he jaywalked across the street and was hit by a car and died. That's unintentional irony. That's about as unintentional irony as you can get. Then there's intentional irony, where we set out to say or do something that's opposite to what's actually meant. But we find irony in Scripture. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's playful. It's playful. And that's something, especially when somebody else is in on the joke. We had a guy that I worked with, and he was a big fella, and he wasn't just. I mean, he was this monster. And he asked that we, I said, his name was, I think his name was James. I said, do you go by Jimmy? He said, no, I'll go by Tiny. I thought, okay, sure. And we called him Tiny, and he was in on the joke, and we thought that was humorous. It's very much an intentional type of irony. But we find it in, yeah. Why'd they call him Hoghead? Wow. Okay. Hoghead. All right. Okay. As long as he was in on that joke, I mean, whatever. Okay. I got you. All right. So so this is the idiom of understatement. First, we've got our irony, the idea of saying something but meaning something opposite. Then we've got what's called the litotes or meiosis. Litotes or meiosis. This is an idea. These are phrases that lessen something in order to magnify another. All right. Litotes or meiosis. These are phrases or words that are used to lessen one thing in order to build something else up or to magnify something else. A couple of examples. Genesis chapter 18 and verse 27. Genesis 18 and verse 27. If somebody wants to turn there, and then Numbers 13:33. Numbers 13:33. Okay, so what is Abraham doing here? How's he refer to himself? I mean, I'm the dust of the earth. I mean, it doesn't get much more insignificant. Now, dust in large numbers gets people kind of antsy because they think the place is dirty, but really, everywhere you go, there's a little bit of dust. There's probably a little bit of dust in almost anything. And if you think about it, the actual dust mote is absolutely infinitesimal. You almost can't see it. It's just when it gathers together in large quantities that you actually see dust. But that's how he refers to himself. But why does he refer to himself like that? Yeah, he wants to make sure that God knows exactly how he feels about him. I recognize you as being supreme above all things. You are the greatest. You are the only God, and all of these things. He could do all that, but he goes so far as to say, I'm but dust. I'm but dust before you. I'm insignificant. I'm nothing. Now, this is the thing. Does God feel that way about Abraham? No. As a matter of fact, there was the idea. I'll put this in. I want to put this in. A lot of times we use this. It's self-deprecating. Okay, it's self-deprecating. It's very fine. You notice that God never calls us dust. God never calls us worms. He never calls us insignificant. He never refers to us like that. I've always said this. Listen, if I'm one that God would send His Son for, then I'm not insignificant to God. That God doesn't look at anybody and say, "You're nothing to me. You're useless. You're worthless. You're less than dust." That's something that we've done in order to magnify God. We use litotes. That's what we use to show how great God is. We're self-deprecating. We make ourselves lower so as to make Him appear bigger. God doesn't need that from us, but that's what we do. All right. Numbers chapter, real quick, this is something like that. Numbers 13, verse 33. Numbers 13, verse 33. Okay. All right. So when he talks about these great men, these men of renown, these men of old, these giants, they're descendants of Anak, giants. Now we talk about giants. The idea of Goliath was probably one of this race, this group of people, but they were still men. They weren't supernatural. They were just a group of people who grew to be very large, around 9 feet. Well, what do these people do? Were they literally grasshoppers? No. Even to a giant like that, would they be grasshoppers? Even for a 9-foot person, I'm not exactly a grasshopper. But what they're doing is they're self-deprecating. They're saying, to these people, we're like nothing. The spies, we're like nothing to these people. We're like grasshoppers in their sight. We're insignificant. And he says, as we felt they were, that's how they looked at us. We felt like grasshoppers, and that's how they looked at us. They didn't regard us for anything. Well, they learned that. They discovered to their eternal displeasure that the people of God were not grasshoppers in their sight because they had God. And if God was on their side, then it didn't matter how small or insignificant they were, God was on their side. Okay? So here we go, litotes, or meiosis, self-deprecating, the figure of speech, to magnify something or somebody else by making ourselves smaller. And it's on our part. They're not saying that. We're saying that about ourselves. Okay? There's a couple more examples. Isaiah 41, verse 14, 1 Corinthians 15, verses 9 through 10. I tell you what, let's do 1 Corinthians 15, 9 through 10. And then we've got one more point, and then we'll finish up. 1 Corinthians 15, verses 9 through 10. Okay. So how does he refer to himself? How does Paul refer to himself? The least of all the apostles. Was he the least of the apostles? No. No. By our standard, based on his input and his output, all of the things that he did, we would consider him to be one of the greatest of the apostles. Now, that's dangerous for us to do as well, that he would somehow take some sort of position of preeminence. He happens to be the one that wrote most of what we read in the New Testament. That doesn't necessarily make him the greatest of the apostles. But what does he do? He says he uses that self-deprecating, I am the least. I know that I'm the least. Now, he said, because I did what? Persecuted. Had God already forgiven him for that? That was over and done with. Matter of fact, he let him do that for a period of time so that he could bring him back, and it would be of more importance when he finally came to his senses and came to the Christ. But Paul is using that to show how I think he's using that to show how great God's grace truly was, and how great God was in forgiving him for the sin that he committed against him by persecuting the church. He makes himself appear small, and he was not doing this ironically. He was meaning this. He says, I feel like I'm the least of everybody. God has just been very gracious to me. He has allowed me to serve in the way that I serve, and I'm going to continue to serve, even though I myself feel like I'm insignificant. So it's I think that's a big point that he was using when he used these litotes. Okay, last and not least, certainly, is the idea of the euphemism. All right, euphemism is a substitution. And what it's doing is it's using a less jarring or less offensive word for something that might be a little harsh, something a little maybe too strong. Genesis chapter 4 and verse 1 gives us an example of that. A lot of times people use euphemisms. We use euphemisms way more than we think we do. When we use the word gosh or golly or darn or dang, we're using a euphemism. We're using a euphemism. But there are euphemisms that we find in Scripture. Genesis chapter 4 and verse 1. What's the euphemism? Knew his wife. Knew his wife. They engaged in an act that brought forth a child. Well, it may not go over quite as well when you use that particular word. For one thing, it starts getting very clinical when you do something like that. So what does he do? He uses the word knew. He knew his wife. We're talking about Mary had never known a man. The idea of a virgin, that encompasses a lot of different types of ideas. But the one that they're talking about more than anything else is that she had never been with a man. That's the idea of known. All right? Genesis chapter 15 and verse 15. Genesis 15, verse 15. All right, what's the euphemism? What's the euphemism? Go to your father, right? What's the euphemism? You shall go to your father. What's the substitution for? You're going to die. You're going to die. But he softens it somewhat, right? Instead of saying, eventually you're going to die and you're going to be buried. No, he just says, you're going to go to your father. I like that. I think that's much better. We use the euphemism, they passed. They passed. They didn't pass anything. They died. But when you're talking about, I'm so sorry to hear about such and such as passing. Instead of saying, I hate to hear that somebody died, well, that's a little jarring, and we're trying to soften the blow somewhat. Absolutely. So we got to be careful. Be careful. We don't want to hurt somebody's feelings. And it's very easy to do that. So we use a euphemism, the idea of passing. They've gone home. We use that a lot, right? They've gone home. One of our saints has gone home. That's more realistic. They have gone home. But we use that as a substitution, really, because their physical body didn't go home. Their physical body died, ceased to function. Okay, last but not least, this is one that most people that may have never even heard of. Judges chapter 3, verse 24. Judges 3 and verse 24. Go ahead and read it. 3 and 24. Judges 3, verse 24. What's the euphemism? Attending to his needs. What was he doing? He was in the bathroom. He was in the bathroom. Hey, he was attending to his needs. Guess what? People in the Bible had to go to the bathroom. But rather than using some crude term, as many times we might want to do, they couch it, especially depending on who you're speaking to. There's things that we might say to say a visitor, in our household. We might say something, excuse me while I powder my nose. That was exactly what it was. That was exactly what it was. They say, I've got to go powder my nose. Well, we know you're not going to powder your nose. You're going in there to go to the bathroom. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's a whole lot better than saying, hey, but the euphemisms we find. And once again, the idea here is that if we're going to understand the Bible, we got to understand all of it. What are some of the things that we read about? What are some of the ways that they describe things? The idea of hyperbole. People don't understand about hyperbole and exaggeration. They think that he's being literal. And he's not being literal. He's making a gross exaggeration, hyperbole, to prove a point, to make a very, very salient point. That it was easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it was for a rich man. Why? Because he knew where rich man had placed their value. He knew he knew what they clung to, and it was not God. They were clinging to their own wealth and their ability to either hang on to it or lose it. Okay, that's it. Any questions? All right. Well, we'll finish this. We'll go a little bit further next week into the idea of figures. There's several more. We'll do that a little bit more next week. I appreciate everybody's attention and input. If there aren't any more questions, then we're going to extend the invitation. If there's anyone here who needs to have the prayers of the congregation on your behalf, we want to do that. If, whatever the need might be, if there's something that's weighing on your mind that we can help with, we want to do that. And we want to encourage, one of the things I want to encourage us is that we're all responsible for each other. And, all we have to do is look around. When we see somebody that's not here, guess what? It is up to every single one of us to reach out and to get that person, to make them aware that we are concerned about them. I know we've got one member, and I have no problem saying this, Justin Hedrick, who placed membership with us, and he attended and then has not been back. And I've called a couple of times, left a message for him, hope to hear back from him, but I haven't. I think this might be a good thing for us to just overwhelm him with phone calls. He'll either tell us to get lost, he doesn't want us anymore, or he'll come back and answer and let us know what's going on. But there's nothing else we can do other than that, but we have to do that. There are people that in our congregation that need the prayers need our prayers, and we're praying for everybody who might need our prayers. But this is a chance for us to publicly respond if we need to. And if you need to, we want you to do that while we stand and while we stand.